The plains were quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of quiet that carried old memories on the wind. Dust drifted low over the dry grass, and the sky stretched wide and pale, like it had seen too much to care anymore. The lone rider moved across the land, slow and steady, his horse worn but loyal. His name was Thomas Hale, and most folks in the frontier town of Red Creek knew him as a man who kept to himself. Thomas had once been younger, sharper, and far more certain of his choices. 20 years ago, he had believed the world was simple. Work hard, trust no one too deeply. Never let the past catch up. He had followed those rules with a hard heart and a closed fist, and they had shaped him into the man he was now. Red Creek came into view as the sun leaned toward the horizon. Wooden buildings stood tired and crooked, their paint faded by years of wind and heat. The saloon doors creaked as if they were sighing. Horses were tied along the rail, their heads low, tails swishing lazily. Nothing had changed much here, or maybe everything had. Thomas slowed his horse near the edge of town. He had not planned on staying long. Just supplies, maybe a night's rest. Then back to the ranch he ran alone. A ranch that felt more like a duty than a home. As he dismounted, a voice drifted across the street. Calm, steady, a woman's voice, carrying authority without sharpness. Thomas froze without knowing why. He hadn't heard that voice in 20 years, but his chest tightened as if it had been waiting. He turned slowly. She stood outside the general store. Older now, her hair pulled back neatly, lines of experience softening her face instead of hardening it. Her posture was straight, her eyes clear. She was giving instructions to a young worker, her tone firm but kind. When she turned and saw Thomas, time seemed to stumble. Her name was Eleanor Wright. 20 years ago, Eleanor had been 20 years old, full of hope and quiet courage. She had loved Thomas when he was too busy proving himself to love her back. She had stood in front of him one evening, hands trembling, heart open, and asked him if there was room for her in his future. He had rejected her. Not cruelly, not loudly, but firmly. He had told her he had no time for dreams or attachments, that life on the frontier was hard, and he could not carry another heart when he barely carried his own. He had watched the light leave her eyes and told himself it was the right choice. Now she stood before him again, and the weight of that moment pressed down on him like a storm that had taken 20 years to arrive. Eleanor looked at him for a long second. Recognition flickered, then settled. She did not smile. She did not turn away. She simply nodded once, as if greeting an old memory she had already made peace with. "Thomas Hale," she said. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice rough. She gestured toward the store, behind her. "You passing through?" "Yes," he said. "Just supplies." "Red Creek has a way of keeping people longer than they plan," she said calmly. He almost laughed at that. Instead, he nodded. "So I've heard." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. That unsettled him more than if there had been. She had moved on, built something. He could see it in the way others greeted her, in the respect in their eyes. Word traveled fast in a small town. Thomas soon learned that Eleanor now ran the Wright Ranch, one of the strongest operations in the area. She employed half the town, kept fair wages, and had stood up to men who tried to take advantage of her land. She was not the girl he remembered. She was a woman shaped by time and choice. That evening, Thomas sat alone in the saloon, nursing a drink he barely tasted. Laughter and music floated around him, but his mind was far away. He kept seeing Eleanor's face from 20 years ago and the woman she had become. The door opened, and a gust of wind swept in dust and sound. Eleanor stepped inside, removing her gloves slowly. The room shifted without realizing why. She did not look at Thomas at first, but when she did, she walked over and stopped beside his table. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'll be riding out to inspect the north fence. There's been trouble." He looked up. "Trouble?" "A neighboring ranch wants what isn't theirs," she said, "and they don't care who they push aside." Thomas knew the kind. He had dealt with men like that before, men who believed strength meant taking. She met his eyes. "I could use another rider." He hesitated. 20 years ago he had chosen to walk away from her. Now she was asking if he could walk beside her. "I'll think about it," he said. Eleanor nodded once. That's all I ask." She turned and walked away, leaving Thomas staring into his glass, wondering if fate had finally circled back to ask him a question he could no longer avoid. Outside, the night settled over Red Creek, and somewhere deep inside Thomas Hale, something long buried stirred, unsure whether it was regret or hope. Chapter 2. Morning came with a pale sun and cool air that carried the scent of dry earth. Thomas stood near the stables, tightening the cinch on his saddle. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor as she was now, steady and strong, and Eleanor as she had been, hopeful and waiting. He told himself he was riding out for work. Just work, nothing more. Eleanor was already mounted when he approached. She nodded at him, no surprise in her eyes. "Glad you came." "So am I," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true or just something he needed to believe. They rode side by side across open land, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. The plains stretched endlessly, broken only by fencing and distant hills. It was the kind of land that demanded honesty. Lies had nowhere to hide out here. After a long while, Eleanor spoke. "You left Red Creek fast back then." Thomas swallowed. "I thought it was easier that way." "For you," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "Yes," he admitted. She nodded. "I stayed. I learned how to stand on my own. It wasn't easy." "I never doubted that," he said quietly. They reached the north fence by midday. Several posts had been damaged, wire cut clean. Signs of horses crossing where they didn't belong. Eleanor dismounted, inspecting the ground. "They're testing me," she said, "seeing how much I'll tolerate." "And how much will you?" Thomas asked. She straightened, meeting his gaze. "Enough to protect what's mine, but not enough to become like them." That was Eleanor. Strength without cruelty. Resolve without hatred. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years believing hardness was the only way to survive. They worked together, repairing what they could. The sun climbed higher, and sweat mixed with dust. It felt familiar, right? Like a rhythm he had forgotten. As they rested, trouble arrived. 3 riders approached from the west, their posture careless, their smiles sharp. Thomas recognized their leader, a man named Cole Mercer, a rancher who believed land was taken, not earned. "Well now," Cole called out. "Didn't know the right ranch needed help from ghosts." Eleanor stood firm. "You've crossed my fence, Cole, again." Cole shrugged. "Mistakes happen." Thomas stepped forward. "Cut wire isn't a mistake." Cole's eyes narrowed. "And who are you to say?" "Someone who won't look away," Thomas replied. Tension thickened the air. Eleanor raised a hand slightly, a silent signal to keep things from boiling over. "This land isn't for sale," she said evenly. "And it isn't yours to test." Cole smirked. "Things change." "So do people," Eleanor said. "But some choose not to." The riders eventually turned away, but their promise of return hung heavy in the air. That night, back at camp, Eleanor sat by a small fire, staring into the flames. Thomas watched her from across the circle. "You could have left years ago," he said. "Started somewhere new." "I did start somewhere new," she replied. "Right here. I chose this life, just like you chose yours." He nodded slowly. "I chose wrong." She looked at him then, really looked at him. "You chose what you could at the time." There was forgiveness in her voice, but not permission. Thomas understood the difference. Redemption wasn't something she would hand him. It was something he would have to earn, step by step. As the fire burned low, Eleanor stood. "Tomorrow will be harder," she said. "If you stay, know what you're standing against." Thomas rose, too. "I'm not afraid of hard." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." The night closed in around them, stars bright and cold overhead. Thomas lay awake, listening to the sounds of the plains, knowing that tomorrow would test not just his strength, but the choices he was finally willing to make. Chapter 3. The next days were filled with tension that never fully broke. Cole Mercer pushed closer, sending riders near Eleanor's land, spreading rumors in town. Thomas stayed, riding fence lines, standing watch, making it clear Eleanor was not alone. People noticed. Some whispered that Thomas Hale was trying to make up for old mistakes. Others said he was chasing something already lost. Thomas didn't listen. He focused on the work, on being present, on showing up without asking for anything in return. One evening, Eleanor invited him to the ranch house. It was modest but warm, filled with signs of a life carefully built. Photographs, worn furniture, a sense of quiet pride. "You've done well," Thomas said. "I had to," she replied. "No one was coming to save me." He nodded. "I wish I had been braver back then." She studied him. "Bravery isn't loud, Thomas. Sometimes it's staying. Sometimes it's waiting. And sometimes—" She paused. "Sometimes it's knowing when to walk beside someone instead of ahead or behind." Outside, hoofbeats approached. A rider arrived with news. Cole Mercer was bringing papers, claiming legal rights to part of Eleanor's land. The fight was shifting from fences to courts, from muscle to manipulation. Thomas clenched his jaw. "He's trying to wear you down." "Yes," Eleanor said calmly, "and I won't let him." In the days that followed, Thomas helped gather proof. Old records, witness statements. He rode to neighboring ranches, asked for help without pride. Slowly, support grew. The final confrontation came not with guns, but with truth. In the town hall, Cole Mercer stood confident until Eleanor presented her case, clear, undeniable, supported by the people who knew her character. Thomas stood beside her, silent but steady. Cole left that day defeated, his power broken not by force, but by unity. Outside, as the crowd dispersed, Eleanor turned to Thomas. "You stood with me," she said, "when it mattered." He nodded. "I should have done that a long time ago." She looked out over the plains, then back at him. "The past doesn't disappear," she said, "but it doesn't get to decide everything." "So," he asked carefully, "can I walk beside you now?" She considered him, really considered him, not as the man who had once rejected her, but as the man who had chosen to stay when it was hardest. "Slowly," she said, "with honesty." A small smile touched his face. "I wouldn't know any other way anymore." They stood there together as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. Two people shaped by time, choosing not to erase the past, but to walk forward with it, side by side, unsure of what tomorrow held, but finally willing to face it together. And as the wind moved, gently across the plains, it carried not the weight of regret, but the quiet promise of something earned.